Who is Carrie? Chapter 9, Part 1 of Chapter 9. It took Horace near an hour to write the letter, even though there wasn't much to it. The idea of it was that Horace wanted to quit working at Flounce's Tavern and go down to Philadelphia. He didn't say so, but I knew he figured that once he was down there, he'd get Willie to marry him. He'd be sorry to leave Flounce's. I knew that because Mr. Flounce had always treated him right, but he was so all-fired in love with Willie that nothing would stop him. He wanted to know from Willie how things was for black folks down there. Was there any good jobs for free blacks? Was there any chance of setting up a tavern or getting into some other kind of business? Horace had saved up considerable money, which Mr. Flounce was keeping for him in his safe. Horace never let on how much it was, but I knew it was considerable. I'd miss Horace. It seemed like everybody was going away from me. I didn't know what I'd do if he was gone. I wouldn't have nobody to talk to. Of course, if Mr. Flounce was let go by President Washington and I went back to the tavern, I'd have the cooks. But they was white, and it wasn't the same. Besides, I didn't want to go back to the tavern for fear of Captain Ivers. It would be mighty risky for me. What would I do if I had to go back there? Maybe I would have to run away. I would hate doing that, but maybe I would have to. I couldn't blame Horace for that, though. He was in love and was bound to marry Willie no matter what. He wasn't in no hurry, though. Horace, he wasn't one to rush into things. He liked to take his time and look at all sides of it first. By the time he got the letter finished, I dozed off in front of the fire. I woke up when he folded it up and give it to Dan. Dan slipped it under his shirt. If Captain Ivers found it, he'd know Willie was in Philadelphia, and went off to the Junius Brutus. Then Horace left, and I was alone. I knew I ought to go to bed, for it was late and I had to be up pretty soon. But I didn't feel like it. I felt sort of low and sad. Horace was getting his life straightened out, and Dan was getting his straightened out too. At least he would if his notes come out to be worth something. But I was getting nowhere with nothing. I was bound to be a slave all my life, and on top of it, I couldn't even find out who I was. What was it all about? Jack Erebus was part of it, and Dr. Johnson was part of it, and even Mr. Flounce was part of it some way. He'd got me from Jack Erebus. But how? And would Dr. Johnson ever look through his papers to see if he had something about me? He was high and mighty, and I wasn't nothing at all. Why would he even think about me? I figured he'd forgot the whole thing already. I sat there watching the fire go down and feeling the chill creep into the room. Finally I shivered and knew I had to go to bed or get froze sitting there. I stood up, and just doing something gave me a little courage, and I resolved I wouldn't just sit and wait. I'd get Mr. Flounce to see Dr. Johnson himself. Dr. Johnson wasn't likely to do nothing for me, but he would for Mr. Flounce. Mr. Flounce was pretty high and mighty himself. It took me 3 days to catch him alone. He was mighty busy and always going off to market to see what was choice. But finally I caught him. I was out in the pantry weighing out some flour for pies when Mr. Flounce came out there to check up on supplies. He said, "I've been meaning to see how you were doing, Carrie. No signs of Ivers, I suppose? Dan's been careful not to let him know where you are, I hope." "Oh, yes, sir. He wouldn't say nothing about it. But he did tell me something that's got me mighty puzzled. He said that the time Captain Ivers come after me with the sheriff, when you wasn't there, he was carrying a paper which said I was his slave. Leastwise, that's what it was supposed to be. It was folded up, but Dan got a look at the outside. It had Dr. William Samuel Johnson's name on it." Mr. Flounce looked surprised. "It did?" Dan was sure about that? Yes, sir, I said. And when he went down to see Dr. Johnson about his notes, he asked him about it. Dr. Johnson, he told Dan he didn't remember nothing about it. He said he would look in his papers to see if there was anything about me. But, sir, I'm afeard he won't. He's too high, and isn't likely to trouble himself about a kitchen slave. And you hoped I might talk to him about it? Mr. Francis said. Yes, sir, I said, if you had the chance, and it wasn't too much trouble. He nodded. I certainly will when I have the chance, he said. It's quite possible that Jack Erebus asked Dr. Johnson to draw up some sort of paper about you, who originally owned you, or something of the sort. I'll try to find out. But I didn't hear no more about it. December went along with Christmas coming up, and we was rushed to death keeping up with the parties and guests and goings-on in general. And then one morning Mr. Francis came in and said that Dr. Johnson himself was coming to dinner along with some others, and the president was going to take them all out to the theater afterward. Sir, I said, will you have a chance to ask him? Mr. Francis looked puzzled, and I knew he'd forgotten, too. If Dr. Johnson has a paper on me? Oh, yes, he said. I'm sorry, that slipped my mind. But I don't think this is the time for it, Carrie. Dr. Johnson will be busy with the president. That was mighty disappointing. What better chance would there be? When would I ever be this close to Dr. Johnson? Never, most likely. If anyone knew why Dan's daddy brought me to Mr. Francis, it would be Dr. Johnson. It seemed like he was the whole lock and key to who I was. If Mr. Francis wasn't going to ask him, and Dan couldn't find out nothing, there was nobody going to do it. And that left me down and out and going through life never knowing who I was and just being nobody at all. But then it flashed through my head that there was somebody else who was going to be close enough to Dr. Johnson to talk to him, and that somebody was me. Carrie No Name herself. And I decided I would try to talk to him, no matter what. But oh my, there were a lot of problems to it. The first was that I didn't know what Dr. Johnson looked like, and wouldn't know which one he was even if he did come. Mr. Francis knew, I figured, but during dinner he always stood out in the dining room telling the waiters to fill up somebody's wine glass or bring out more squash or whatever it was. There wouldn't be no way I could get him to point out Dr. Johnson. The second thing was, even if I knew which one Dr. Johnson was, how was I to get into a conversation with him? I wasn't allowed in the dining room when the white folks was eating for fear I might breathe on them or something, and it wasn't very likely that Dr. Johnson would come marching out to the kitchen and introduce himself just in case somebody wanted to ask him questions. There was only one way to do it. Catch him somewheres before he came into the house, or catch him somewheres after he finished dinner and was standing outside waiting for his carriage, and the first wasn't no good because I didn't know who he was.